The government is never broke and can never need to impose austerity. The UK can never run out of pounds.
In this video, I'm exposing the holes in modern monetary theory, MMT, and arguing that austerity is not a political choice as far as capitalism is concerned, as far as capital per se is concerned. And to do that, I'm going to critique a video by Richard Murphy, a social democratic economist. In a previous video, I critiqued Gary Stevenson's call to tax wealth, not work. But in this one, I am largely defending him from Murphy's recent critique of Gary Stevenson. Murphy is adamant that austerity is wholly a political choice. To briefly recap on what I said in my video critiquing Gary, communists should critically support taxes on extreme wealth as a way of building up the activity and organizational power of the working class. But we must be clear that taxing wealth is not sustainable because it eats into profit rates that are already falling to historic lows, which will therefore make capitalist resistance increasingly aggressive if they want to stave off their own bankruptcy. Rates of profit fall historically towards zero because expanding and accelerating commodity production naturally devalues, cheapens commodities, meaning there tends to be less profit per commodity. That's the crucial point. This means the commodity-based system is unsustainable, and its replacement by one whereby goods and services are decommodified and demonetized becomes absolutely necessary. We should therefore preferably struggle not for a wealth tax, but for public ownership of production land and services, where possible via compensation of the last capitalists via long-term debt payments in order to try and temper and limit their aggressive tendencies as much as possible. However, because communists are in the minority right now, opposing extremely popular demands for wealth taxes would be to run too far ahead of the mass movement and into self-isolation. Gary expects the Labour government is soon likely to significantly raise taxes on what he calls middle-class incomes, by which he roughly means the richest 20% of earners and households outside of the top 1%. Gary argues this is going to happen because the super wealthy, as he calls them, can do little else with their passive income than buy up assets, including government assets, which they then rent back to the government. As a result, since the 1980s, governments have continually spent more than they've collected in taxes and run down the country's wealth, putting the government into more and more debt, from which lenders to the government tend to accrue more and more interest. The more debt rises, the more nervous lenders are about the prospects of being repaid, and so they demand even higher interest rates, putting even more strain on the tax base. The government therefore borrows more and more and sells more and more public/state assets until it has no choice but to aggressively cut its spending and find new sources of taxation. The four sources are, says Gary, 1. Raising taxes on the super rich. 2. Raising taxes on the working poor, which is hardly an option since that source has already been bled dry. Slashing welfare spending, which Labour has already done, although not to the extent that it's apparently planned. 4. Raising taxes on the middle class, that is, higher income workers and non-super rich asset owners. Right-wing governments such as Labour are therefore most likely to raise taxes on the middle class in combination with the welfare cuts that they've made. And this is because they are largely funded by the super rich. I agree with a lot of Gary's assessment here. He is quite close to the truth in that capitalists do need to buy up more and more assets, but he doesn't really explain why precisely. They do so because capitalism demands ever more capital accumulation, which is compelled by the falling profitability of expanding commodity production. When profits in commodity production run low, money capital becomes passive and therefore leaches off of unproductive sources, i.e., through rent seeking and de facto zero sum theft or wealth transfers. While Gary does say that the government is doing what it is doing because it is funded and controlled by the super wealthy, he does not stress that the government in a capitalist society serves a capitalist state and the requirements of capital accumulation, i.e., of the very economic system itself. Richard Murphy, of course, agrees that the super wealthy are attacking the working and middle classes. He, like Gary, calls for the solidarity between those two sections of the population, which I agree with. And he agrees that Labour is likely to raise taxes on middle incomes, but he disagrees with Gary's framing that the government is running out of money or going broke. So let's hear his critique.
Effectively, what Gary does is repeat the household budget myth. The simple fact is that households are constrained as to what they can do by the availability of money to them. And they can only get the money by earning it, or by being given it by way of government benefits, or by borrowing it. That's it. But they can't create money. But the government creates all the money that it needs to spend without exception. Tax funds nothing, borrowing funds nothing as far as the government is concerned.
Richard Murphy is a proponent of modern monetary theory, MMT. While MMT is not wrong about everything, it does get a fair bit wrong, not least because it is a reformist social democratic theory that believes private property is sustainable and can go on infinitely. The claim that government spending is not funded by taxation and borrowing is untrue. Taxation is the largest part of government revenue, and once collected, it is sent to the Treasury, which then spends it. The Bank of England is, for now, state-owned, but it does not lend to the government directly. It lends to banks, financial institutions, and corporations in order to boost their ability to lend to the government by purchasing government bonds, which the government later repays with interest. The Bank of England does this lending, if necessary, by digitally adding money to its own reserves, expanding the money supply. Whether the Bank of England could just give the government all of the money the latter spends is another question, which I'll come to shortly. In the US, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is a public-private institution. The central bank is organized like a private enterprise. Its stock is provided by its member banks, which are private institutions. The critical point is this: the central bank functionally serves the public, but the public in a capitalist economy is subordinated to the needs of capital accumulation. So the central bank actually serves the capitalist nation state as a whole, and the capitalist nation state tends to need to centralize capital into fewer hands in order to offset falling profitability, again, thereby facilitating capital accumulation.
Tax reclaims the money that the government has spent to control inflation, and bonds are issued as a savings mechanism, first of all, to provide people with a safe place to put their money, and secondly, to take additional money out of circulation if that is necessary for the sake of controlling inflation as well.
Tax does play a role in controlling inflation, but usually quite an inadvertent one. One thing tax does is redistribute wealth via government spending, something that Murphy and MMT has recognized, but which they regard as a secondary role, which rather contradicts their claim that tax does not fund government spending. As capital's profitability diminishes, capital is increasingly dependent on state funding and subsidies, i.e., on public debt and taxation, on redistributing wealth from workers to capital and capitalists, from smaller businesses to larger ones, or after a certain point of no return, from unprofitable ones to profitable ones. This is perhaps best shown by the fact that over the past few decades, as profitability has fallen ever closer to zero, corporate taxes have been lowered more and more to offset the problem and ongoing privatization of public wealth. Government bonds are not simply about savings and controlling inflation. Capitalism is about making money and profit, investing money into commodity production in order to get a larger amount of money back. This is why capital needs to accumulate, because profit is growth. without a sufficient amount of profit, investment is disincentivized and private companies go bust. When investment opportunities in commodity production are relatively low because of the underproduction of profit that inevitably arises from expanded commodity production, some money capital is reduced to being uninvestable surplus money capital and is instead partly channeled into bonds and other forms of passive income, such as money market funds. This money only grows by taking money away from other sources or by raising debt, not by creating new real value in physical commodity production. So returns on bonds are a way of making the public pay for shortfalls in profit. The state uses the money raised from bonds towards its spending, which again largely involves redistributing money upwards among the most powerful private corporations.
But because the government can always create more money, it can never go broke. So this story that it can, which is absolutely core to Gary's narrative in this video, is just wrong. And worse than that, it's dangerously wrong, because the story that the UK is broke is the narrative that gives cover to the austerity agenda. Those who promote austerity and say we have to cut public services, and Gary recognizes that they exist in what he has to say, use this story to justify the fact that we are unable to meet service demands and therefore they must be cut. And Gary actually talks about that possibility. And none of that is true.
In the UK, state institutions issue banknotes and coins. Digital money is created by the Bank of England and commercial banks, both of whom loan digital money into existence. Producing money digitally is a quicker and more efficient way of keeping up with commodity expansion, and so physical money makes up a smaller and smaller proportion of the money supply. As profitability wanes, surplus money capital that cannot be invested rises, and so scarcity rises and prices rise as there is relatively less money available to pay for goods and services. To stave off or overcome an economic contraction, a recession, the Bank of England will usually lower its target interest rate, which then impacts rates on the market. The target rate is achieved via creating digital money and lending it to the private sector. Doing this increases the reserves banks hold at the central bank, which pushes down the central bank's interest rate since the money it provides is more readily available. Banks with low reserves therefore don't need to borrow so much money from other banks because their individual reserves increase, lowering especially short-term lending rates, stimulating lending to productive goods-making companies that can now afford the lower interest rates, in turn stimulating economic growth, or more precisely, capital accumulation. The interest the central bank pays to banks on the reserves they hold at the central bank is also adjusted lower, incentivizing banks to withdraw funds from the central bank and lend them to capitalists and investors at a relatively higher rate. So yes, the central bank can create digital money out of thin air on behalf of the state, but it doesn't directly fund government spending. It purchases debt that private institutions bought from the government and private debt, such as mortgage-backed securities. In this way, private debt is turned into public debt to be worked off by the working class if value-creating productivity can outpace the issuance of debt. If the government or the state can or could simply create digital money and just give it to state departments or private institutions interest-free, as has been disingenuously claimed by Elon Musk lately, the point is somewhat moot. If the government creates money purely in this way, it will create or add to a state deficit. The state can tolerate a deficit, but only to a certain extent, because quite obviously, the state cannot pay for everything in a capitalist economy. If it tried to, money would be so abundant that money would be worthless, and capitalist production would collapse absolutely because profit making just would not be possible. The state will therefore try to fund its deficit by issuing bonds. Because the larger its deficit grows, the more expensive borrowing needed to meet spending commitments and debt servicing, that is, repaying debt with interest, becomes. If it spends without borrowing or taxation, the extra money will work its way through the economy, devaluing the money supply and resulting in or adding to abnormally high inflation, which makes running costs and the cost of investment more expensive and therefore hinders capital accumulation. If the money is spent on subsidizing privately owned commodity production, the expansion in commodity production devalues commodities as usual and in turn money. The more commodities in circulation, the more money tends to be in circulation. The expansion and devaluation of commodities devalues money. If the money is spent on the publicly owned sector, then no new exchange value is created because none of the value created by workers is siphoned off by capitalists. That would mean more money is chasing the same amount of commodities, again stimulating inflation above the targeted overall rate of 2%. The figure is set at 2% because it keeps borrowing rates affordable, allows businesses to plan ahead, and prevents deflation when overall aggregate prices fall absolutely because investment and spending has slumped absolutely and to a decisively impactful point. This investment slump, though, usually happens primarily because of the underproduction of profit and the overaccumulation of capital, this surplus capital that is unprofitable to invest. With money capital uninvestable, prices eventually rise to a point whereby savings and reserves run dry and spending falls. The economic contraction, the recession, and the ensuing panic selling at cut rate prices, coupled with the devaluation of money, re-enables spending and investment, and some portion of surplus capital re-enters productive investment in commodity production. Most capitalist governments prefer to prevent absolute deflation because, of course, they want capital to be accumulating and they want as much social stability as possible, which compels them to print enough money to prevent absolute deflation. Every dollar or pound or euro that comes into existence is loaned into existence by banks and central banks, i.e., as debt, which means that every new unit added to the total supply equals more than one unit in future demand, because at some point that person or entity is expected to pay that money back plus interest. If the money supply is not continually increased, then as debt is paid back, the total money supply starts to recede, making it harder to get your hands on money, making money more valuable relative to everything else, causing prices to plummet as a mad scramble for money begins amid the realization that there are relatively few pounds or dollars compared to all the debt that needs to be paid back. One man's unpaid debt is another man's insolvency, so debt does matter. Interest is a form of profit, a claim on profit produced in commodity production. So, like profit rates, interest rates have fallen historically ever closer to zero. The 2008 recession, known as the Great Recession, relatively the worst since 1929, was followed by a period whereby the central banks in the US and UK pushed their target rates down to record lows just above zero for a very long period of time. The same happened again during the pandemic lockdowns, which happened on the back of a massive rise in surplus capital and flatlining growth. But despite an unprecedented boom in the money supply and the private sector's access to interest-free money, we have seen the most stagnant post-recession recoveries since the 1930s depression. Because interest rates could basically go no lower, the massive spike in the money supply, in combination with record high levels of surplus capital and thus accelerating bankruptcies and productivity cuts, has manifested in stagnant growth and high inflation. MMTers agree that inflation is a limit on money creation and that the government therefore needs to allocate spending appropriately, like disproportionality theory promoted by pseudo-Marxist reformers, especially in the early 20th century, effectively arguing that the government should ration subsidies going to some parts of the private sector so that the money can be spent more usefully or rationally, either on other parts of the private sector or by the publicly state-owned sector. In this way, MMTers claim the government always has the capacity to enable full employment and good public services. MMTers will say this doesn't happen because of purely political limits. But this logic is ignorant of the fact that capital needs to accumulate. Capitalists who allow or submit to a reduction in the subsidies they receive are signing up for future bankruptcy, and are therefore likely to eventually resist such moves as aggressively as they can. When money capital becomes surplus, investment in value creating commodity production falls, which means investment in labor falls. Unemployable capital results in unemployable labor. This helps capital by reducing the outlay on wages, immediately aiding the rewidening of profit margins that need to be kept high enough to attract or retain investment, and because a reserve army of unemployed labor reduces the bargaining power of employed workers, cheapening the price of the wage. If the government then steps in and spends money to ensure full employment, the price of profit-eating wages rises, the deficit grows, and money, bonds, and subsidies are devalued. When the demand for bonds falls, interest rates on bonds rise, making the government's new or rolled over debt more expensive. Rolled over debt is when the government takes on new debt to pay off old debt instead of paying it back from revenue or savings. Falling demand forces the state to sell bonds at lower prices, making it hard to bring in state revenue and meaning more units of currency are needed to pay off the same amount of debt, which in turn incentivizes central bank money creation. The higher government debt rises, the more likely investors are to worry about receiving returns from an increasingly stretched tax base, which also generates inflation concerns from a growing devalued money supply, which devalues the value of bonds and the returns received, potentially making bond holding a loss-making endeavor. Bondholders therefore reduce their purchasing and or demand higher interest rates, which obviously either goes on to make government debt grow at a faster pace and or forces the government to cut its spending. Since 2021, the US's public debt has been higher than at the end of World War II. Here is the crucial point. We know that monetary and exchange value comes from commodity production because a totally publicly commonly owned and therefore decommodified economy only needs units of account. It does not need money as a medium of exchange because no exchange of ownership is necessary in a total monopoly, which must by definition be commonly owned. There would be no private parties exchanging products. Everything would exist in a singular system and is instead socially produced and socially consumed. The one quality that all commodities have in common is that they are products of labor. So the essence of their exchange value must be labor time. MMT falters because it rejects Marx's labor theory of value. The MMT solution, a reformist social democratic one, is therefore unsustainable unless the capitalist class rolls over and accepts its demise and dissolution as a class, in which case the MMT solution is unsustainable because the Marxist solution is realized. More likely, the capitalist class will eventually fight back and try to force the state, probably by getting rid of the MMTers and other social democrats in government, to cut spending on wages and public services so that public money is redirected into private funds, or so that private funds are not deducted of money put towards public spending. At which point the public and the working class must either concede ground or fight for a higher degree of public ownership, ultimately until the economy is wholly publicly owned, which means successfully struggling to subdue and ultimately disarm and completely defeat the capitalist class. The option to simply defend the level or degree of public ownership and wealth is not an option, precisely because capitalism is a dynamic system incapable of some kind of indefinite, steady state equilibrium.
The only constraint on the government is not its capacity to create money, because it can always do that. The constraint is its capacity to find things to buy, that is, people and resources who can be put to public use. That's completely different.
Murphy and other MMTers say government spending is limited by the amount of land, labour, factories, and other useful things available to buy, and that inflation will get too high if spending continues beyond full employment and so-called full economic capacity. But again, the state will have to buy up the whole economy for this to be sustainable, which is what we should actually do. MMT's own logic therefore effectively contradicts its claim that the government can never go broke, because the state printing money without borrowing and taxation to buy up all of the land, labour, mines and factories that the capitalist class cannot afford to put to use would either result in hyperinflation or it would make the private sector uncompetitive, in which case private capital would either have to destroy state-owned property or be taken under state ownership. This is why the New Deal in the US in the 1930s only went so far before being reined back in. President Roosevelt took the relatively extra bit of spending away from public infrastructure and the working class and instead subsidized capital accumulation through weapons manufacturing, and in turn contributed to World War II's destruction of surplus capital, which ended the Depression by opening up new opportunities for profitable investment and accumulation. The capitalist class's aggression towards social democracy diminished in the wake of World War II because the demand for labour was very high, profitability was high, and some state ownership was required to take the burden of the societal rebuild off capitalist profits. Today, we have a record high level of surplus capital, relatively as well as absolutely, so such conditions do not presently exist. So when Gary Stevenson is asked to point to a time when taxes on the rich have worked, and he points to the 50s and 60s, he is overlooking this crucial factor.
He's pretending that the government is a microeconomic actor. In other words, it suffers whatever the market lets it have. But that's simply not true. The government creates markets. It regulates markets. It creates money. It creates the tax system in which they operate. It creates the rules of contract by which they operate as well.
The state does aid and enforce the creation of markets, but it does this to facilitate capital accumulation. If capital isn't accumulating, companies, business owners, shareholders are going bust and jobs are being lost en masse. When the boom does turn to bust, the assets of bankrupt companies are bought up on the cheap by private corporations sitting on sufficiently deep cash reserves. The richest companies with the largest market share therefore accrue more and more power over the state and gain the capacity to shape regulations at the expense of their competitors and, of course, workers. The state in a capitalist nation state is a capitalist state. The capitalist state arises historically as a vehicle of class rule to enforce the rule of the capitalist class over its predecessors and now over the working class, and as a medium for settling disputes between competing capitalists.
And there's a danger of using false metaphors in the way that Gary is doing. If you say the government is broke, as he has, then you enable the austerity agenda. If you say the government is broke, you then enable the neoliberal idea that we mustn't tax the rich because we're utterly dependent upon them for our well-being. And if you talk about the government as a household, you say that it is the victim of markets, and so we mustn't in any way disrupt markets, because if we were to do so and those who operate within them, there is nothing that can be achieved. And all of those things are wrong.
Here, Richard is right, but mostly for the wrong reason. While I more or less agree with Gary's explanation for the government going broke, he doesn't provide a sustainable alternative, which means he is bound to be discredited when wealth taxes fail. His idea that the economy can be rebalanced and living standards sustainably saved by taxing wealth doesn't sit well for another reason. He says in the video that Richard is critiquing that, quote,
"If you do not get systems in place such that you can tax the very rich whilst their wealth is aggressively growing, every single group of society, including the middle class, will be destroyed.
Perhaps he misspoke here, but that line suggests that we should not stop the wealth of the super wealthy from growing, that we should not stop the ongoing privatization of public assets and wealth, only that we should tax part of the public wealth that they swallow up. The Labour government is, for example, allowing councils to sell off public land, including allotments to private house builders. This move should be utterly opposed. It will further destroy the environment and the last vestiges of public independence. Only around 8% of UK land is publicly owned as it is, down from about 20% in 1979. Gary may be opposed to this privatisation as well, but his argument implies otherwise. In conclusion, privatisation and austerity go hand in hand. Privatisation and capitalism go hand in hand. Capital accumulation is ongoing privatisation of public value and public wealth. Privatisation and austerity are two of the things that capitalists and their state must pursue to offset and stave off falling profitability, to stave off their own economic downfall. Opposing privatisation and austerity therefore requires opposing capitalism per se, which requires establishing a socialist state that will progressively take the whole economy under public ownership. Ultimately, this has to be done worldwide. This is especially true now because of the automation revolution, which is accelerating the devaluation of commodities, including money and the price of labour power being what workers sell to capitalists. Once the state owns the whole economy, the state no longer exists, because the state is by definition the rule of one class over another. At that point, the transition from capitalism to communism is complete, and we have a classless, thus stateless society, and a singular mode of production that is commonly owned. We no longer need money as a medium of exchange, and taxes now fund social services and public infrastructure instead of subsidizing capital. We no longer have to worry about producing for profit. We no longer have a crisis of falling profitability. We no longer have uninvestable, surplus capital and unemployed labor. We will instead, without those problems that are inherent to capitalism, be able to build an economic system capable of developing higher and higher living standards for all on a consistent and sustainable basis. We don't really need to tax wealth as such, we need to universalize it. We don't only need to stop austerity and government cuts to welfare, we don't need a bit of public ownership or a bit of downward redistribution, we need a fully publicly owned economy. Right, I'll leave it there. Thank you for staying the course, and as usual, please share the video if you found it useful with the MMTers in your life. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't before, and if you can, please send a tip or sign up to regular donations on my Patreon. Help me rehabilitate Marxism, help me on my mission to eradicate the economic illiteracy that has been promoted by capitalist society and reformist economists. Thank you, and see you in the next one.